For our project, we selected the language of Cape Verdean Creole. On this first slide, I'll discuss the history and origin of Cape Verdean Creole. The language of Cape Verdean Creole is based on Portuguese and African languages. It dates back to the 15th century. It first originated as a pidgin language based on Portuguese that was used for trade or business in Cape Verde. Then, during the slave trade, the pidgin used by slaves was brought to Cape Verde as well, and merged with the Cape Verdean pidgin to create Cape Verdean Creole. When the slave trade ended, Portuguese became the official language of Cape Verde, but the created Creole was still the primary language used by the people of Cape Verde. Cape Verdean Creole is actually multiple Creoles, but is considered one language by the Cape Verdean authorities. There are technically two branches of Cape Verdean Creole. Sotavento Creole is used by the southern islands of Brava, Forgo, Santiago, and Mayo. Barlavento Creole is used by the northern islands, Baio Visto, São Nicolau, São Vicente, and São Antonio. As I mentioned previously, after the slave trade, Portuguese became the official and international language of Cape Verde. Portuguese is seen currently as the language of the elite or the language of the educated in Cape Verde. Portuguese is used for formal communication, such as administrative tasks, education, literature, justice, or mass media. For example, any official legal documents would be conducted in Portuguese. However, Creole is still considered the primary language of majority of the people in Cape Verde. It is considered to be informal communication and used for daily life. Creole represents the culture and national identity of Cape Verde. As I previously mentioned, after the slave trade, authorities in Cape Verde pushed for the use of Portuguese as the only language in Cape Verde. They believed that having schools teach in Portuguese would fix the prevalence of Creole and persuade the people to use Portuguese as their primary form of language. However, this did not have its desired shift and actually created a large divide amongst the people of Cape Verde. As I was speaking about from the previous slide, the authorities in Cape Verde created a very large divide amongst the people when they decided that Portuguese would become the official language. Professor Manuel depicts this divide in his quote. Then Portuguese became an elite language and the language of the educated. So you had people who didn't speak it, especially people in the fora, the countryside. And because of that, if you speak Creole, you are put down. Even today, I have seen people go into an office, and if they spoke Portuguese, they were looked well upon, but if they spoke Creole, it was the opposite. In fact, they called Creole the kitchen language and Portuguese the living room language. It is apparent that this divide is still present within the current society of Cape Verde due to the decision of the authorities during the 15th and 16th century. Even though there is a large divide amongst the people, Cape Verdean Creole is still used as the main language of Cape Verde. The Creole is needed for direct communication amongst people. It's actually even used for political campaigns as well as in church. So churches actually ask for donations in Creole. And Creole is the language of oral literature in Cape Verde. The writing system for Cape Verdean Creole is called Alupec, or the Unified Alphabet for Cape Verdean Writing. This language also has an alphabet. However, The writing of Cape Verdean Creole is not yet standardized. Not all citizens of Cape Verde use either of the systems of writing or the alphabet. The system is also not used on official documents, materials, or signs because Cape Verdean Creole is not an official language. Professor Manuel, who I referenced before, actually is working on unifying Cape Verdean Creole in order to get this writing system in place. There are a few interesting facts that I learned about Cape Verdean Creole while researching the history. The first is that Cape Verdean Creole is actually the first language learned by most people in Cape Verde. So children actually learn Cape Verdean Creole before they learn Portuguese. Cape Verdean Creole is known as the unofficial language of Cape Verde. It's also spoken in other places, such as Angola, Brazil, Guinea-Bissau, Portugal, and Senegal. I also found it very interesting that the professor I mentioned from my research and his daughter actually recently created the first Cape Verdean Creole English dictionary.
These next few slides will be about the phonology, morphology, and syntax of the Cape Verdean Creole language. These slides will also compare the Cape Verdean Creole language to the English language. The comparison shows what could be difficult for an L student trying to learn the English language. This quote shows the history of the general features of the Cape Verdean Creole language systems. It states that a number of morphosyntactic and semantic features found in the Cape Verdean language varieties can possibly be traced to specific Portuguese dialects, and African languages. More precisely, depending on the different periods of settlement and the identity of the original settlers and slaves, the resulting dialect would display distinctive morphic, syntactic, and semantic features inherited from language that came into contact. The phonology of the Cape Verdean Creole language comes from the 15th to 17th century Portuguese. It continues to use consonant J and CH at the beginning of words which are considered affricate consonants. Digraphs DJ, LH, NH, and TX are not considered letters in the alphabet, but they are used as two letters. Vowel plus N is also considered a digraph. The Cape Verdean Creole language has 24 phonemic vowels. It has a total of 16 phonemic vowel sounds, 8 oral vowels, and 8 vowels with nasal counterparts. The phonology comparison between the Cape Verdean Creole language compared to the English language is that all the letters in the alphabet are the same, except that the English alphabet has the letter W. Also, the Cape Verdean Creole has more consonant digraphs than the English language, but both languages have affricate consonants. To discuss the morphology of the Cape Verdean Creole language, we will first discuss nouns. Nouns in the Cape Verdean Creole language are gender inflection for human and animals. Plural nouns have plural marks when it is known as more than one. The next part is adjectives. Majority of the time, adjectives come after the noun. Nouns and adjectives must be the same for gender inflection. The third part is verbs. The verbs only have minimal inflection. They have the same form for all persons, and notion of tense, mood, and aspect are expressed through the presence or certain morphemes as the majority of Creoles. There are two forms, the past and present tense. The present tense verb form is the same as future tense. The majority of verbs used is present. The mood of the sentence is expressed through verbs. The morphology comparison between the English language and the Cape Verdean Creole language is that the English language has 5 vowels compared to the Cape Verdean Creole language that has 16. Words in Cape Verdean Creole can have more than 2 morphemes in a word, just like the English language. The syntax in the Cape Verdean Creole language is that the sentence structure is subject, verb, object. When there are 2 objects, the direct object comes after the indirect. The setup is subject, verb, indirect, direct. What is also common is using double negatives in sentences. They refer to it as double negation. The syntax comparison between the Cape Verdean Creole language and the English language is that the sentence structures in the English language needs a noun and a verb also must express a complete thought, while the sentence structure in Cape Verdean Creole is subject, verb, object. Similarities is that all sentences need a verb and a noun, and students in this language will be familiar with verbs and nouns.
Hi everyone, my name is Emma LaFleur, and I'm going to talk about the semantics, pragmatics, and discourse varieties of Cape Verdean Creole. For semantics, the first thing is that there are some words that do not translate one-to-one between Creole and English. For example, Cape Verdeans might say close the lights instead of turn off the lights because when you take what they say in Creole literally, they actually translates to close the lights. When English, we say turn off the lights. Another thing is that, like for all language learners, English idioms can be very difficult to understand unless explicitly described and taught. For example, I was working with a Cape Verdean student, and she was having a difficult time understanding the phrase butting heads when she came across it into a passage. Once I explained it, she understood. Next, some Cape Verdean words do not have an English equivalent. Therefore, there are some ideas that students may have based on their first language that they can't communicate in English. One example is morabeza, which describes the friendliness and hospitality of Cape Verde. And another is saudade or saudade, which relates to the homesickness of their homeland. They're missing their homeland, which is something that all of our students are going to feel, whether they come from Cape Verde or not. But it's something that they're feeling that they can't communicate in English. So it's good to keep that in mind. Finally, most Cape Verdean Creole vocabulary, the lexicon, comes from Portuguese, but over time, the meaning and pronunciation of some of those words have evolved. So if you know Portuguese, there are some words that you'll recognize in this Creole, but it may not be quite the same. So it's good to keep that in mind too. The next thing is pragmatics. So for greetings, they're fairly long. They include a handshake or a kiss on the cheek for women or people who are close or related or good friends. They often include an inquiry about each other's family. And this is done every time two people meet, even if it is more than once in one day. And this greeting is super important, and it must come before the actual conversation that the two people actually want to have. In contrast, Americans have much shorter greetings, and we don't always talk about the other person's family unless we know them really well. Usually, if in a greeting, we'll talk about the weather, something else before we start an actual conversation. For conversing, Cape Verdeans stand pretty close to each other, and they often touch or hold hands while they're talking, and they talk with their hands. Americans usually keep a farther distance while talking, and we don't usually touch after that initial handshake. And Cape Verdeans are very hospitable and social, and will gather together whenever they can. For example, in my high school, if you come at 2:30 at the end of the day, you're going to find all of the Cape Verdean students outside the guidance wing, and they'll stay there and talk and chat for about 15-20 minutes before they head home. For time, things are done at a much more relaxed pace. Cape Verdeans may be a little late to work or class because they've stopped and talked to a friend on their way to their destination, because for them, that social aspect is very important, and talking to the people that they know is more important than being on time. While in American culture, we're going to say, hey, sorry, can't talk right now. I'm running late. I got to run. So sticking to a schedule for Cape Verdeans is not as important as it is in American culture. Another piece of important information is that Cape Verdeans hold on to their Creole. They're very proud of their language. It's a huge piece of their identity, and so they're going to use it whenever they can to converse with each other. Finally, for discourse varieties, Creole is only used in familiar settings, not in formal ones. So in formal or official settings, which includes school. So most Cape Verdeans are bilingual with the Creole and Portuguese. Cape Verdeans use Portuguese to communicate, and Portuguese is the official language of Cape Verde. In general, while talking to each other, Cape Verdeans show that they value the other person and do not wish to insult them. So when one person invites another to a party or event, Cape Verdeans will often say that they will try to attend the event, even when they know that there's no way that they're going to be able to make it. They already have other plans or whatnot. They're never going to say, no, sorry, I cannot attend, but thank you for the invitation. They're just going to say, I'll try to attend. I'll try to make it. I'll try to be there. There are many different dialects of Cape Verdean Creole. Each goes with a different island, but the dialects are sometimes unintelligible from one another. So a Cape Verdean from one island and a Cape Verdean from another island, when they're speaking Creole, they may not be able to understand each other, which is a big reason why Portuguese is the official language. It's kind of a unifying factor because they can talk to each other in Portuguese when they can't understand each other's Creole. And finally, even though there is an alphabet for Cape Verdean Creole, which was talked about before, Creole is not commonly written. Like I said, Cape Verdeans use Portuguese in school. The government is going to use Portuguese. So usually Cape Verdeans will use Portuguese when they're writing. So there aren't really any discourse varieties related to writing. It's all about speaking. And the Creole is really, like I said, spoken in familiar settings, at home, with friends, things like that. Thank you for listening to my piece. I hope you're learning a lot about Cape Verdean Creole, and I hope you enjoy what Amy has to say next. Thank you.
The next 2 slides talk about the cultural norms for Cape Verdeans. Then I'm going to go into a slide about the communication rules, and then there are 2 slides about classroom implications. This voiceover is going to cover those next 5 slides, starting with cultural norms. In Cape Verde, the cultural norms. In Cape Verde, the class system doesn't have much variation. A majority of Cape Verde is poor and low income. Cape Verdeans are very generous and caring, and Cape Verdeans are very social, and they strongly value their relationships with others. Culture plays a huge role in the way of life on the Cape Verde Islands. These cultural norms and traditions will still impact those whose families have come to the United States from Cape Verde. Cape Verdeans take pride in their informal language of Creole, which has been previously stated, it differs amongst the different islands. Children are taught at a young age to respect their elders, and parents are very strict with children for behaviors. The next slide shows a map. Cultural norms. Cape Verde has a unique mix of African and European aspects of culture because of its geographic location. People from the northern islands identify more with the Portuguese culture, and people in the southern islands identify more with an African culture. Communication rules. It's been previously stated in pragmatics that Cape Verdeans typically have lengthy personal introductions with others because Cape Verdeans are very social. Some nonverbal communication norms you might see would be that Cape Verdeans are close talkers. They use physical contact often when communicating. This might look like touching, hand-holding, or hugging. And this is common with both women and men. Classroom implications. Culture plays a major role in a student's learning and school experience, no matter what country their family came from or what their background's like. Cape Verdean is more of a collectivist and high culture context in the United States. In a previous text I read, I'm quoting from Hammond, that in a collectivist culture, learning happens through group interactions and dialogue, as opposed to In the United States, we're more used to an individual study and reading. So many aspects of the Cape Verdean culture are a lot more relaxed. For example, the timing, and a lot more social than the American culture. This could be a conflict in the United States classrooms. The teacher would need to have clear expectations and a way to communicate this information to families. A student would need to know when throughout the day it would be acceptable to engage in social conversations with peers. A visual that shows voice levels might be helpful for these students, but it's also helpful to give these students some time to communicate with their peers. A language barrier might be difficult with families that speak Creole. There's many different dialects of this informal language, and some words might not be able to translate correctly. A translator will be needed to communicate with families, and technology can sometimes be used. Whether a Cape Verdean student is new to the United States or not, they may be going through stages of cultural accommodation. So it's super important to just create a safe and nurturing classroom environment that promotes language development for these students. English language learners, students, benefit from clear language, clear expectations, and visuals. A successful teacher would not allow cultural diversity to become a barrier in family engagement in the classroom.